I didn't sleep last night.
Oh, this is going to go great. Nice beach in Florida.
Before we go into the depths of hell that is Florida, I want to just recap. If you want to join the Gaslit Nation live taping on January 24th at noon, which is going to go for about an hour, followed by 30 minutes plus Q&A, live audience Q&A, but also the early bird special where we're all going to log into the Zoom room together starting at 11:45 a.m. sharp. Sarah and I are going to be joining at the exact same moment as you. You're going to get to see how we do the show, how we throw it all together, and then hit the record button. So if you want to come early, you're welcome to join us for that, or I'll show up at noon for the show itself. And to get a ticket to that, if you're not already supporting the show at the Democracy Defender level or higher on our Patreon, all you have to do is just buy your ticket to the live taping before the 24th of January by going to patreon.com/gaslit, Patreon, patreon.com/gaslit, GASLIT, and just sign up at the Democracy Defender level or higher. Treat it like you're buying a ticket because it's an event. It's going to be an event, and we're going to get through it together. So thank you for that. We look forward to seeing everyone on the 24th. All right, now let's get into the hell basket that is Florida. Every good podcast should have a Florida special of some sort because Florida is the source of so many woes in the world. We were inspired to do this because Bolsonaro, who was voted out of office barely in Brazil, the Trump of the Amazon, he was holed up in Florida. And it's sort of like you have these several wannabe dictators in Florida at once, Bolsonaro, Trump, and DeSantis. And so what makes Florida such a magnet for fascists? And that was sort of the thesis statement that kind of led this conversation. And it just ended into this big winding road of weirdness and corruption and Russian intelligence and Russians keeping the FBI Florida offices very busy and so on. So we're going to get through all that. It is, full disclosure, non-exhaustive because it's Florida, which gave us George W. Bush becoming president and ushering in the end times we're currently all living through together. And doing a great job, I might add. Like, pat yourself on the back for getting through these times. Then, of course, the tragedy and the trauma of Trayvon Martin. And then you have DeSantis and his Russian-style anti-gay laws. You have Mar-a-Lago's spy den and the stolen classified document black market of Mar-a-Lago, and so on and so on. So there's a lot of different directions this could have gone. This ended up going. You'll see. You'll just stick around. We're going to some weird places. All right. So Trump, Bolsonaro, DeSantis. Again, why are so many wannabe dictators in Florida? The irony is that Florida has a large Latinx community of people who escaped dictatorships in places like Cuba, Venezuela. So how has Florida become a fascist hotbed of wannabe dictators? Here's what we mean. Eduardo Bolsonaro, the son of Jair Bolsonaro, was in Washington, D.C. during Bannon and Trump's violent coup attempt January 6th. Eduardo rushes to Florida after his father lost his election, meeting with Trump and Bannon. His father, before his term is even up, rushes to Florida, takes refuge there. Florida is also home to a growing Russian community. These are not the asylum seekers. These are rich Russians flocking to Florida, even having anchor babies in Florida so that their families can eventually become U.S. citizens. And the growing Russian money in Florida is aligned with, you guessed it, Trump. The Republican Party and their consultants are also all camped out in Florida. That's the power center of the RNC now. And Ron DeSantis has employed a lot of Kremlin-style tactics, rewriting history, banning history, passing anti-gay laws. These are all the things that Putin was doing in his rise to power. He's also using asylum seekers to flood the borders of his political opponents, again, straight out of the Kremlin playbook, straining resources of his political opponents and trying to drive political division. It's really uncanny how much the Kremlin playbook DeSantis has been relying on.
Ron DeSantis had a very close relationship with Lev Parnas, of Parnas and Fruman, who were involved in the illegal shakedown of Zelensky. They were working closely with Rudy Giuliani. Back in 2018, 2019, it was reported that Parnas met with DeSantis at least 6 times. There was, possibly money exchange. One thing that's really damning is that when I went and, decided to look into this again recently, so many of the articles about the two of them and about their relationship with DeSantis are either deleted, and I can still see screenshots of them on Twitter from when they were originally posted, or they are paywalled, as is true with the Miami Herald, or they're just, very difficult to find. Information is getting buried very deeply, but there's a lot to look in here with Lev Parnas. He's still around there. When there was that mysterious building collapse in Surfside in 2021, Lev Parnas was one of the people on the scene, which is a little weird because he's a convicted felon. He was allegedly there to help out. Other people in the Trump camp living right near Surfside, include Jared and Ivanka. This is also where Roger Stone was based for a long time. Jeffrey Epstein was based there. It's really there's a lot going on. But DeSantis, given his prominence and the fact that he may run soon, needs to be investigated more for his ties to the Russian mafia, in particular to Parnas and Fruman, to their operation, which extends abroad. Instead, what we're seeing is Parnas's son being invited to the Biden White House as a special guest. So there's that.
Florida is going to be huge in 2024. It's the power center of the fascist movement. So Florida is basically the Russia of the United States. That's an easy way to think of it. In this conversation, we're going to talk a bit about the Russian immigrant community in Florida. And we're not trying to be xenophobe, but let's be clear. These are rich Russians who have the means to move to Florida, who have the means to live in some of these very wealthy communities in southern Florida. These aren't the asylum seekers. So imagine if you're Canadian and a group of American Trump supporters started moving to Montreal or whatever, you'd be a little concerned. So we have great sympathy for Russians and what they've gone through. We've talked about that since the start of the show. I've paid tribute to the Russian resistance in my film, Mr. Jones. Paul Kleb, a character in my film, was shot with 4 bullets in his back, just like Boris Nemtsov, a Russian opposition leader who was shot with 4 bullets in his back in the shadow of the Kremlin, and so on. So this isn't about like Russians bad, xenophobia. This is about a certain kind of person who benefited and was complicit in the widespread corruption of Putinism. That's how they made their wealth. And now they're parking that stolen wealth in Florida and entrenching Russian influence in Florida. So it's about the Russian version of the Trump supporter, basically. And wherever you live in the world, you wouldn't like a bunch of American Trump supporters moving and gaining influence in a certain area, right? So that's the context of this conversation, not to be like anti-immigrant or anti-Russian. It's really a certain kind of person, which is, fascist sympathizing and had made their wealth through illicit means, basically. And that brings us to welcome to Sunny Isles Beach, otherwise known as Little Moscow. According to a recent local news report, wealthy Russians are dodging sanctions by buying up condos in Little Moscow. It's an area it's in Miami-Dade County, just north of Miami. These condos that they're pouring their money into will remain empty and are known as ghost condos because they just need a place to park their money. The transactions are super secretive and done by LLC corporations. My guess is that the entire Russian government owns ghost condos in Sunny Isles, Florida. Obviously, and so because Putin's war was this total genocide he launched in February of last year, it was known to a small group of Michael Flynn conspiracy theorists who work closely with Putin inside the Kremlin. And So the larger Russian apparatus all around them, those guys were caught off guard. So naturally, they're going to be parking their money somewhere in order to have it safely stowed away. And Sunny Isles Beach is an extremely popular destination. So just like the Nazis fled to Argentina and Chile, Russia's Nazis are stashing their cash and at least financially fleeing to Sunny Isles Beach, the Brighton Beach of Miami-Dade County. So Sunny Isles Beach, aka Little Moscow, is also home to a years-long service that operated out in the open for rich Russian women and other rich women from post-Soviet states to fly over to Sunny Isles Beach to have babies so that their children could be born American citizens. And when their children became, I think, the age of 21, they could then apply to bring the rest of the family over to become U.S. citizens and so on. There was even a company that helped them called Miami Mama, which would go on to be raided by the FBI. As you'll see, there's a common thread throughout this that the Russians are keeping the FBI busy in Florida. So Russian women have been flocking to Little Moscow, Florida to have anchor babies, and this went on for years, probably still goes on because these aren't the type of immigrants that DeSantis cares about because they're rich and white. It gets even weirder. And they're buying up Trump properties in Florida from Reuters. I'm reading now from Reuters. A Reuters review found that at least 63 individuals with Russian passports or addresses have bought at least $98.4 million worth of property in 7 Trump-branded luxury towers in southern Florida. The review focused on Florida because the state has a large concentration of Trump-branded buildings. The resort town of Sunny Isles Beach, site of 6 of the 7 Trump-branded Florida residential towers, stands out in another way. The zip code that includes the Sunny Isles buildings has an estimated 1,200 Russian-born residents, among the most in the country, U.S. Census data show. Sarah, could we just stop right here and point out how weird it is that Sunny Isle Beach is the Brighton Beach of Florida? It's full of Russians and Trump properties, just like the original Brighton Beach in New York City, which is also full of Russians and Trump properties. Who was instrumental in developing the original Brighton Beach? Trump's father, Fred Trump. The Trump fortune was made off of Russian money back then and today. Trump's fate was sealed as a Russian asset. It was something he was born into, a legacy of his father. Remember when they opened up the Soviet Union, so Jewish people from the Soviet Union could immigrate abroad, and that led to like a big influx of them coming over to New York City. And that's when you saw them really taking off in that area of Brighton Beach. And then who's meeting the needs of those growing Russian immigrants, post-Soviet immigrants, or Soviet immigrants? Fred Trump. And and as they start taking hold, you have the Italian mafia getting pushed out because the brutal tactics of the Russian mafia take over. They outmuscled the Italians. And now you have a dominant Russian mafia now in the U.S.
Yeah, no, that's right. And the comparison with Fred Trump is really interesting because with Fred Trump, they're basically like two, elders who groomed Donald Trump in his role as the front man for transnational organized crime. And one of them was Fred Trump, and the other, of course, was Roy Cohn. And when you look at South Florida, when you look at the areas around Miami, those are the areas that were held by various mafia syndicates all throughout the 20th century. That like Al Capone had a home there. And more notably, that's where Meyer Lansky lived. That's where Meyer Lansky fled when he first, after he fled the United States in 1972 for Israel, because he was finally getting indicted under RICO. He then, ended up coming back to the U.S. because so mysteriously, the FBI decided not to charge him after all for his lifetime of crime. Sound very familiar? Anyway, so Cohn for Trump, was somebody who introduced him to the Lansky syndicate, but also, you see the same presence in South Florida. You see this rotation between those two bases of New York and South Florida, for these transnational criminals. And you, of course, literally see that with Trump and his two residences of Trump Tower and Mar-a-Lago. Both are places where people traded and sold and state secrets. Both are places, in the case of Trump Tower, literally a dorm for the Russian mafia. For Mar-a-Lago, more of a place to pass through. But yeah, there's this deeply connected lineage. It's part of American history. It helped construct what we would euphemistically call the American justice system. And it's very, very understudied. It's understudied by the media because they're afraid, I think, of violent repercussions. It's understudied in the social sciences because I don't know how you get IRB approval or something of subject approval for studying the mafia, because the mafia doesn't want to be studied. But yeah, there's definitely a major overlap there.
Yeah. And I